we're here to talk about oil and governance in the Gulf of Guinea, the role of business, are they responsible, and does corporate social responsibility promote development, and also the role of the state and the impact of oil on governance and development, which I think in an age where oil prices are shooting up past $100 is, I think, absolutely at the core of the issue of governance in most of Africa's oil-producing states. I'm not an academic. I did study here many years ago. So after that, I went on to be a journalist, and I now work as a consultant for some of the companies that perhaps are part of the equation. Some of the oil companies, some of the banks and other institutions that are behind them. And I think that the fact that some of those companies are beginning to question how they operate in this part of the world, what's in their best interest, what's in the best interest of their shareholders in the longer term, I think is a sign of a questioning, a re-evaluation that's going on at the moment, and why I was particularly pleased to do this, and very keen to hear what these two chaps have to say. I was only briefly going to try to introduce some of the issues as I saw them, and then Ricardo and George were going to speak for 15-20 minutes each, and then we're going to have questions. But it seems to me that oil companies like certainty. They don't like to get too involved in government. That they see themselves, perhaps in some cases, perhaps as having much less leverage and influence over the processes in which they're involved than perhaps objectively might be the case. I think in a country like Nigeria, and if we're talking about the Gulf of Guinea, it seems to me that this is an area in which perhaps over the last 20 years the definition has expanded quite rapidly. Oil-producing countries, perhaps in the 1980s, early 1990s, were Nigeria, Angola, Gabon and Congo principally, but over the last 20 years an explosion of interest in exploration, new technology, rising prices has seen interest from Mauritania down to Namibia, over to Tanzania, and several countries in between. Equatorial Guinea is a major oil producer, Ghana's producing oil, Chad, Sudan, Uganda, Tanzania, also is Madagascar joining the game. So I think that this is a principle, or some of the issues that perhaps we're talking about, maybe much more relevant to many more people now than perhaps was the case even a few years ago. I think in Nigeria, which is perhaps the most established oil province in Africa, and also where there's considerable onshore reserves and issues with communities, I think that the kind of laissez-faire attitude of oil companies of trying to take shortcuts, of trying to meet short-term goals, has perhaps in the longer term worked against the interests of their shareholders. They now find themselves having fueled a corrosive political culture in which the rule of law, which is the cornerstone of all effective long-term investment, has been compromised. That they find themselves caught up in long-standing local tensions, which they have limited capacity perhaps to influence, that they're drawn into a world of private security companies, intelligence agencies, all kinds of areas which get in the way of perhaps what they're meant to be best at, which is developing oil assets outside of the region, even in faraway domains. They find themselves caught up in America, in alleged allegations of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations, and calling into account of some of the shortcuts that they make overseas. It ends up being an adversarial platform in a sense that takes different forms in different places, even in much smaller countries, Sao Tome, Equatorial Guinea, Ghana and Guinea. It seems that political factors end up being a key component of whether oil companies are successful in the short term and in the long term, rather than technical capacity, financial backing and so on. Part of the problem, I think, in this expanding world of interest in natural resources in Africa is that aside from the established provinces, new countries, emerging countries find that they're under pressure to provide attractive packages, perhaps to anonymous and exotic companies that end up securing particularly generous terms when those in the interest of competition and a particular country bringing in investment where maybe others have failed. The trouble is, I think, that if oil actually ends up being discovered, it ends up polarising the investment climate of governments, sometimes feeling they've been ripped off by foreign powers, and sometimes issues ending up in disputes. And short-term thinking ends up costing governments, ends up costing companies, and ultimately ends up costing people. I think that the key here really is that it's easy to identify some of the questions, perhaps much more difficult to come up with the answers, which is why it's very great this evening to come up with, to have with us some of the brightest and very able, I was going to say youngest perhaps, not quite as young as we all used to be, academics, because I think that the answer to some of these issues is in detail. George and Ricardo have both worked on countries in the region for a very long time, produced very good work, and I think are still engaged in developing this dialogue of what really works in terms of how the impact companies make and what really is the most effective mechanism for developing systems that have a capacity to provide a greater public good rather than focus particularly on that short term. Now, I'm thinking that George actually has a PowerPoint. Maybe we should start with George, and perhaps George could kick off. I think George first, perhaps, and then Ricardo, and then have questions afterwards.
Okay, welcome everyone. I've been given the brief before this as my homework to introduce 3 issues. So what I will be talking about, trying to cover 3 questions. One is, what do companies actually do in the region? 3, what are they responsible for? 2, responsible for, and 3, what, or to what extent have companies addressed some of the impacts they have been contributing to. So let's start maybe with the handout that I've just given out. I hope you have a copy. I just thought I'd give you a few facts and figures to start with. On the first sheet is just a historical overview of oil production. I think the key figure on that is number 12, 12% of world oil output. That's how much Africa makes up. So that's how important it is in the global oil industry, 12% of world oil output. Looking at some of the countries, when we look at the region, we're talking especially about Nigeria and Angola. The big story of this is, if you look at the figures on the other side of this page, you will see how Angolan oil production has increased over the last 10 years, whereas other countries haven't done as well. I've been talking Nigeria, for instance, about increasing production by 50% for a long time. It hasn't happened for political reasons. Maybe Ricardo will go into it later. The question, what do companies do in the region? When you are thinking of oil companies, you probably think mainly of Shell, BP or Exxon. So big multinationals, they do everything from upstream oil exploration and production to selling at the petrol station pump. There are also the other companies which only do part of that. And even if you think of Shell or BP in Africa, whilst they do some marketing, the main activity is exploration and production. That's what